Hello. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I present this paper is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who have lived on this land since time immemorial. I am grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. Land acknowledgements like this are rightly more and more common in public gatherings. Many people believe, however, that they run the risk of sounding hollow if they aren't accompanied by additional discussion or actions that help to address the negative consequences of colonialism. The need to decolonize and confront anti-BIPOC racism is more clearly apparent today than perhaps at any other time. One could ask, what role can someone who identifies as white, straight, cisgender male settler play to make a positive impact? I am presenting today because I believe having conversations on this topic, being open-minded and listening, are critical first steps to make constructive change. As a music theorist, my focus in this topic is on our university music programs and theory curricula to see how we can do better. To this end, this presentation is in three parts. First, I will give an overview of some excellent discourse by experts in decolonization as applied to music and specific theory programs in universities. Second, I will give an example of one program's efforts to address these problems in the theory curriculum and program design, and using my and my colleagues' efforts at Carleton University as a case study. Finally, I will do a bit of a deep dive into one musical example written by a non-white, non-European, non-classical composer to illustrate how a wide variety of musical theoretical concepts can be used. I hope to show how easy it can be with just a little bit of effort to both counter European-centric bias and diversify the theory curriculum without sacrificing depth and rigor. In academic writing, authors such as Daniel Cavicchi argue that we need to consider how we are mitigating curricular bias in European centricity in higher education. He summarizes music program thinking this way: classical music is serious, valued, and worthwhile. Popular music is interesting, but extra, good for departmental enrollment numbers, but not a core part of disciplinary practice. As scholars like Philip Ewell point out, the problem is perhaps most deeply ingrained in the music theory classroom. He writes, the musical compositions that we teach in music theory classroom are written by white persons overwhelmingly. This is to say nothing of the race of the people behind the theoretical premises that undergird these compositions. These theories are also, of course, overwhelmingly written by whites. There is a growing collection of scholarly literature on decolonization. Recently, in 2019, MusCan's journal Intersections published a special issue dedicated to the topic Decolonizing Music Pedagogies, edited by Robin Attas and Margaret E. Walker. In the first article of the issue, they write, the standard Bachelor of Music curriculum remains centered almost entirely upon the study of elite concert music of Europe and its diaspora, a music more identified as Western, classical, or art music. They also state, quote, although arguably simplistic, European colonial activities can be divided into examples of exploitation, with the primary goal of resource extraction, and settlement, where the primary goal was appropriation of land for eventual immigrant ownership. End quote. From my perspective, I see music programs that exclusively or predominantly study classical music as a form of settlement or appropriation. Cultural focus on European music dominates the time and space within the required courses students take in their programs. We can also see universities offering token courses in jazz, pop, and world musics, often as electives only, or even worse, as brief units in music history courses dominated by classical music. Building on the writing by Juliet Hess, Darren Hamilton writes, the tourist model encourages that non-Western classical music genres be briefly introduced into the curriculum while maintaining Western classical music as normative. One might view this as the exploitation of musical culture, supporting a dominant narrative of classical music being the epitome of musical evolution. Ewell refers to these ideas as the white racial frame, for which he calls on us to deframe and reframe into a new narrative to address racial diversity. So are universities inherently colonial institutions, or are we able to adapt? I think one of the first steps is to reject the evolutionary model of valuing music that achieves certain levels of complexity in arbitrarily assigned criteria. For example, is the functional and hierarchical use of harmony better in a romantic symphony than in the timbral use of chords in blues tonality? Or the counterpoint in a Baroque fugue, is it better than the improvised polyphony in the frontline instruments of New Orleans jazz? While some argue for dissolution of our institutions of higher learning that fail to acknowledge these biases, I would advocate for a more proactively pragmatic approach. Teaching classical music isn't wrong, but it is just one musical tradition among many equally valid ones. Our music theory class would be better off as theories of musics. We need to listen to others' voices, be advocates and allies, and let our students also teach us. And most importantly, let us design our bachelor music programs with core courses exploring a diversity of musics and theories, and not just in elective courses. It's okay not to get it right all the time, but as educators, we have to make the effort. So what should our programs include in the curricula of our core music theory courses? What repertoire? Should our theory courses continue to focus exclusively on harmony, almost exclusively on harmony and part writing? And is figure-based still a necessity? Are we introducing our students to improvisation, which is a proven way for them to engage deeply and creatively in the development of relevant skill sets in music? Are we including non-notated analytical skills in our oral training courses? Can we deprioritize notated music in favor of developing our ears? Is it experiential enough? Are we appreciating the historical, cultural, and context of the music that we study? And finally, in the core curriculum, do we spend nearly enough time on learning about meter and rhythm? In my university program, the theory core consists of 3 streams: theory analysis, oral training, and applied rhythm training. The last one taught by my colleague, Kathy Armstrong. Taught over 2 years, Kathy's experiential courses give students multiple tools for exploring, understanding, and embodying rhythm. South Indian conical syllables, West African drumming, dancing, singing, clapping, and graph notation are all tools weighted evenly with Western rhythm notation. By developing personal pulse through multiple modes of communication, students can find new ways of understanding rhythm and its role in music. Then, with our oral skills classes, which I teach, we again focus on experiencing music. Like most schools, these develop musicianship through sight singing, dictation, and keyboard harmony. Specific attention in this case is drawn to skills with diverse stylistic applicability. I'm not alone in relying too much on the piano to deliver this course content, I think. So I strive to include activities of instrumental and vocal improvisation, and oral analysis of recorded musical examples, often from pop music. In this music, we focus on hearing texture, instrumentation, melody, in addition to its chord structure. Finally, I give students a project for them to select some of their own materials to sing with solfege or numbers, allowing them to focus their studies on music that specifically interests them. These activities help all students discover the stylistic connections between what we study and the music in which they are most engaged. In the core theory courses, first term theory or theory 1 really has no need to focus exclusively on classical repertoire and theory. In the early stages of theory study, the vast majority of the concepts we teach have wide applicability, so the repertoire can be more diverse. The same goes for theory 2 and 3, though admittedly that's where our pervasive emphasis on harmony and voice leading typically lead us back to classical music for a wealth of musical examples. In a moment, I will counter this presumption by looking deeply at a non-classical example. But what about Theory 4, or any required third-year theory course? In a cursory survey of university music programs in Canada, it appears that the majority of these focus on either classical form and analysis or that of 20th century classical music, usually modernism. At Carleton, my colleague Mark Ferguson teaches our core Theory 4 course by focusing on jazz and pop music instead. This experiential course gives all students, regardless of their instrument and genre focus, an introductory survey into the repertoire and organizational structures of jazz and vernacular styles of music. Many music theorists struggle with wanting to include greater diversity, but not diluting the study of classical theory and analysis. In a decolonized curriculum, how do we do this? I would argue that with every concept we teach, we demonstrate when and how they can be used appropriately in different stylistic contexts without bias. For example, teaching parallel fifths can be very frustrating if anyone assumes that they are universally relevant. Rather, I share that these systemic restrictions apply to only some, but not all tonal music, and only under certain conditions. This allows students to appreciate a compositional constraint at work, for example, avoiding parallel fifths in the chorales of J.S. Bach for independence of line, as we see in this example. It isn't relevant, however, to the textual doubling in Clara Schumann, like the end of her Schedule No. 2, or Bill Weathers' classic Lean on Me. We know that even Brahms found numerous examples of Mozart breaking this rule, and that hasn't hurt our appreciation of Wolfgang's creativity. Learning how to compose like an 18th or 19th century composer is a niche skill set and not relevant to the vast majority of music students. This is not where our priorities in teaching a theory class should lie. I'd like to focus the last part of this paper on expanding a repertoire that we use for analysis. Bobby Hebb's Sonny, his greatest hit from 1966, is now a much-loved soul jazz standard that has been covered numerous times. As an African-American guitarist and singer-songwriter, the inclusion of one of his songs can expand our classical analytical canon with diverse repertoire and BIPOC representation. It gives us an opportunity to make connections between the analytical depth in our theory class curriculum with that of social historical breadth in our pop and jazz history courses. I invite you to stop this video now and listen to a recording of this piece. Here is a lead sheet I wrote for Sonny without the lyrics. With multiple verses, the melody deviates in a variety of ways, but this rhythmically simplified transcription is roughly accurate for at least one of its verses. There is so much that can be studied for oral analysis alone, but just looking at this notated representation, we might see that this piece can successfully demonstrate many different topics in a theory core curriculum. And with spiral learning, we can return to this piece a number of times to reinforce concepts while learning new ones. Let's start with the melody itself. While written in a minor key, all the notes fit into a pentatonic scale, which wonderfully links into its blues origins. The melody also fits both E minor and G major, highlighting the relationship between relative major and minor tonality. Further, by circling back to this piece at a later point in study, we see that in measure 4, there's a hidden melodic minor scale segment rising from C sharp to D sharp, eventually arriving at an E in measure 5. As I mentioned earlier, I question the value of figured bass in the curriculum, but for full disclosure, I do use figured bass myself for some analytical purposes. As a notational shorthand, however, I believe a much more beneficial system to all students is that of lead sheet notation. We should all learn it. This lead sheet for Sonny introduces students to both harmonic content and how melody interacts with its chord structure. To that end, this piece can be an effective introduction to seventh chords, having them played on as keyboard harmony exercise would relate oral training, keyboard skills, and theory class content. Lead sheet notation is also an excellent entry to studying upper extensions of ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. Returning to the pentatonic melody, we find this is a fascinating example of non-chord tones. While the melody itself is strongly grounded in E minor, the move to the G7 chord in measure 2 sets up the high E tonic as a dissonant 13th. Incomplete neighbor tone, which we could call an appoggiatura, that resolves to the D. Similarly, the A in the next measure resolves to the G. There are also examples of passing tones and neighboring tones throughout this piece. And the fluidity with which Bobby Hebb sings gives us an opportunity to discuss topics such as syncopation, anticipations, and performative forms of suspensions. For an advanced topic, we could circle back and consider John Kovacs's concept of textural stratification. The melody is grounded entirely in E minor pentatonic, but the chords deviate from that, creating a stratified but otherwise logical relationship in texture. In jazz theory courses, 251 patterns is a cornerstone topic. Yet it parallels the important predominant dominant tonic phrase model in classical theory courses. This allows for a great deal of cross-stylistic conversation. The F sharp minor 7, B7, E minor pattern occurs 3 times in this short piece, each time as a cadential and tonally affirming gesture. A really interesting aspect of the harmonic structure appears when comparing Hebb's original song to some prominent covers. A more jazz-influenced cover, such as that performed live by Pat Martino with John Schofield, includes an interpolation of a D minor 7 chord in the first half of measure 2, thus tonicizing the submedian with its own 251. By contrast, measure 4 could be replaced simply by a B7 chord. This is what a number of different performances do, including that by Stevie Wonder and others, including one by Billie Eilish and Phineas in their covers of the song. This creates a C major 7 to B7 pattern from measure 3 to measure 4, complete with those forbidden parallel fifths. Returning to Ewell's hope to reframe how we teach music theory, the interpolated 2-5 progression can be used as a clear introductory example of structural hierarchy without the pragmatic Schenkerian value assertions that favor European music. Theory 2, and especially Theory 3, often address chromaticism and tonality. Sunny provides a clear example of a secondary dominant with the G7 resolving to C in measure 2 to 3. The role of the F major 7 chord is also interesting in its possible interpretation as a flat 2 or Neapolitan chord. Perhaps it could lead an advanced class into a discussion of tritone substitutions or mixture chords. The role of modulation is also present, and an interesting feature of this tune is the chromatic rise through F minor and F sharp minor and then finally G minor in the last 3 verses. Each time, the last tonic note is reinterpreted as the third of a 5-7 to a new key, a pivot note modulation. For example, the E in the second ending of measure 16 becomes part of a C7 chord that sets up the new tonic of F minor. Students are also exposed to an excellent example of enharmonic reinterpretation here, as shown as a D flat 7 chord moving into the F sharp minor in verse 4. Lastly, this song's 16-bar form can serve as a framework to discuss AABA song forms. We can also see a 4-bar phrase model in measures 1 to 4 and measures 5 to 8. I would argue we can also see this as a prime example of sentence structure with its 4 plus 4 plus 8 phrase groupings. Incomplete, incomplete, then complete. Other topics could involve motivic structure, cyclic forms, text-music relationships, musical texture, and topics in the recording production process. As I bring this presentation to a close, I want to stress that there are no definitive answers to these systemic problems of European-centric bias in our theory curricula. This shouldn't stop us from trying to improve our programs despite them being flawed. We already fight against political forces intent on defunding the arts, so working together in the music education of our students and the arts in general is essential. We need to create the opportunities for dialogue, and we need to listen. Listen to underrepresented artists, listen to experts in decolonization, and engage in conversation. In this way, we can conscientiously rethink our music degree requirements, create opportunities for professional development for theory instructors, retool our pedagogies, and diversify the music theory curriculum. Thank you.